Saudi Arabia is a repressive authoritarian regime, but it's also been a U.S. ally for decades. Does this relationship make sense? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. The U.S. has important diplomatic relationships with almost every country. Some of them are friendly. Some of them are more like frenemies. But there's one relationship that's, how should I put it, weird and complicated. It's kind of like that friend you've had since preschool, but now you can't look at their Facebook posts anymore because they occasionally talk about killing journalists. And that friend is Saudi Arabia. The U.S.-Saudi Arabia alliance dates back to the early 1930s. In fact, Saudi Arabia is America's oldest ally in the Middle East. Since then, we've had the chance to see pictures of a lot of U.S. presidents in some truly interesting moments with Saudi leaders. Hold on. Is Saudi Arabia's entire diplomatic strategy just giving U.S. presidents gold friendship necklaces? I mean, everyone loves looking at their new gold medal. But don't be fooled. There are a lot of issues that make this a very rocky relationship. You see, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia don't always see eye to eye on issues, like human rights. Saudi Arabia is consistently ranked among the most repressive societies in the world. At least, that's in the eyes of Freedom House, a non-governmental organization that conducts research on human rights. It's consistently on their worst of the worst list, along with countries like Eritrea and North Korea. There's effectively no freedom of speech, press, or religion in Saudi Arabia. In fact, Saudi Arabia forbade women from driving cars until just last year. And it still tortures and assaults those women's rights activists who campaign for the right to drive. The country is governed by an interpretation of Sharia law, so it imposes capital punishments like executions for non-violent offenses. Also, Saudi Arabia killed that Washington Post journalist who wrote stories critical of the Saudi government. The point is, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia just don't hold the same principles on human rights issues. In the U.S., if you criticize the president, Trump might call you fake news, but you don't exactly get murdered for it. Oh, and there's one other teeny tiny thing to mention about Saudi Arabia. In the September 11th attacks, 19 men from the terrorist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 airplanes and killed almost 3,000 people. 15 of those 19 terrorists were from Saudi Arabia. So was their leader, Osama bin Laden. So you would think that would really make the U.S. want to break up with Saudi Arabia, right? Well, not exactly. For years, there was speculation that the U.S. government was covering up ties between Saudi Arabia and Al-Qaeda because of 28 pages that were classified from a congressional report from 2002. Those 28 pages were finally declassified in 2016, and they didn't contain any smoking guns. The official 9/11 Commission report published in 2004 found no evidence that the Saudi government as an institution or senior Saudi officials individually funded Al-Qaeda. But both the 9/11 Commission report and the 2002 report talk about how individuals and charities based in Saudi Arabia funded Al-Qaeda, while Saudi officials turned a blind eye. So why is this relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia so valuable and so impossible to drop? Does Saudi Arabia cook really good food? Laugh at our dumb jokes? Hold our hand when we just need a friend? Well, there are several reasons the U.S. keeps Saudi Arabia close. First, there's the oil. Saudi Arabia's oil reserves are the second largest in the world. The first largest is Venezuela, but Venezuela is not looking so hot right now. Saudi Arabia has been supplying the U.S. with oil since the early 20th century, but that hasn't always gone well. In the early 1970s, Saudi Arabia took part in an oil embargo against the U.S. Cars had to line up around the block for gas. And waiting in line used to suck even more before we all had Facebook on our phones. Anyway, the U.S. has relied on Saudi Arabian oil for a long time. At its peak in 2003, the U.S. imported more than 2 million barrels of crude oil per day from Saudi Arabia. It's gone down since then, especially in the last 2 years. Now it's less than 600,000 barrels per day. That's because the U.S. has tried to wean itself off its dependence on Saudi Arabia for oil by producing more of its own. According to an April 2017 report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, over the past 10 years, U.S. liquid oil production has risen by over 150%, and net import dependence has fallen by over 60%. So Chris, what are you saying? Should we just stop buying Saudi oil altogether and move on with our lives? No, that's not what I'm saying. The U.S. still needs foreign oil, at least until renewable energy gets a lot more efficient. AOC, I'm counting on you. Not really. Anyway, it's worth considering that we should improve U.S. oil refineries, and we should acknowledge that U.S. refineries are more environmentally friendly than those in a lot of other countries. But back to Saudi Arabia. In return for all of that slick crude oil, the U.S. trades weapons and other technology. The Saudis have consistently needed weapons and reinforcements, because things in the Middle East have always been a bit tense. The Obama administration signed a deal in 2010 to sell $60 billion of arms to Saudi Arabia. It was the biggest arms deal ever at the time. Then, in 2017, the Trump administration announced a $110 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia, because obviously, Trump has to outdo Obama. Here's what President Trump had to say on 60 Minutes about the U.S.-Saudi Arabia arms deals while discussing the killing of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
Would you consider imposing sanctions as a bipartisan group of senators have proposed?
Well, it depends on what the sanction is. I'll give you an example. They are ordering military equipment. Everybody in the world wanted that order. Russia wanted it. China wanted it. We wanted it. We got it. And we got all of it, every bit of it.
So would you cut that off?
Well, I tell you what I don't want to do. Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, all these, I don't want to hurt jobs. I don't want to lose an order like that. And you know, there are other ways of punishing, to use a word that's a pretty harsh word, but it's true.
Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon. They may sound like Pokemon, really scary Pokemon, but those are the names of the U.S. aerospace companies and defense contractors who manufacture and supply a large chunk of the world's arms and military equipment. And the largest buyer of American weapons is, you guessed it, Ash Ketchum. I mean Saudi Arabia. According to the U.S. State Department, Saudi Arabia is the U.S.'s largest foreign military sales customer. Last November, President Trump said it would be foolish to cancel the arms contracts with Saudi Arabia.
$110 billion will be spent on the purchase of military equipment from Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and many other great U.S. defense contractors. If we foolishly cancel these contracts, Russia and China would be the enormous beneficiaries and very happy to acquire all of this newfound business. It would be a wonderful gift to them directly from the United States.
And Trump doesn't believe in giving generous Christmas gifts to China and Russia. And part of the U.S. government's interest in trade with Saudi Arabia is about countering countries like Russia and China in the Middle East. For example, China is already trying to involve Saudi Arabia in its trillion-dollar global infrastructure plan known as the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese leader Xi Jinping met with the Saudi Crown Prince in February. The two later signed a $28 billion deal for economic cooperation. Trump must feel really hurt about this. I mean, after all he and Xi have been through. Now, the February deal wasn't the first big deal that China and Saudi Arabia signed, but it's interesting that Saudi Arabia has agreed to boost oil exports to China, while China has reportedly decided to take in more Iranian oil too. Talk about playing both sides. Either way, the U.S. is fighting China's Belt and Road as China continues to try to woo countries with the promise of big bucks and profitable trade. So that partly explains U.S. interest in trade with Saudi Arabia. But the arms deals with Saudi Arabia have also been profitable for U.S. companies. But apart from oil and arms, Saudi Arabia has other strong economic ties to U.S. companies, particularly through foreign investments. Saudi Arabia is the largest single investor of capital for U.S. startups, more than any American venture capital fund. Last September, it invested in Tesla competitor Lucid. And in 2016, it bought a $3.5 billion stake in Uber. Which explains why you hardly ever see a woman driving an Uber. Just kidding. Maybe. Anyway, Saudi Arabia used to invest heavily in industrial sectors, but lately it has a thing for Silicon Valley. the place where tech companies like Apple, Google, and Facebook live. The total amount of money the Saudis have dropped in investments is unclear because the full figures aren't exactly public. But where do they get all that money? Well, the state-owned Saudi Public Investment Fund helps out quite a bit. It's one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East, and its funds are focused on technology. And if there's one thing American tech companies love, it's money. But back to geopolitics. If there's one thing that you think of when you think of the Middle East, it's regional stability. Okay, not really. But the US has been trying to promote stability in the Middle East for years. Peace in the Middle East, brah. For example, Saudi Arabia and Iran hate each other. So naturally, the US tried to get them to play nice. Obama famously said the Saudis and Iranians need to just share the neighborhood in peace. But that didn't work out, and now they're fighting over Yemen, which is a topic for a previous America Uncovered video. And the US itself doesn't exactly get along with Iran, although Trump has said he doesn't want to go to war with Iran. But if a conflict with Iran does happen, it would be helpful to have Saudi Arabia as a partner just across the Persian Gulf. And of course, there's the threat of terrorism. Saudi Arabia and the US share intelligence about terrorist groups and other possible threats in the region. Obviously, they don't share intelligence all the time. But it seems Saudi Arabia did help the US fight ISIS, as I talked about back in March. But in an investigative report, CNN says Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners have handed US weapons to fighters with terrorist links in Yemen. According to CNN, a US defense official confirmed they were investigating the issue. If true, this is a violation of Saudi Arabia's agreements with the US, and it would mean a country who is supposed to be allied with the US may be handing its enemies the tools to commit terrorist acts. That story has not ended well in the past. So the current state of the US-Saudi Arabia relationship involves oil, economic ties, and conflicts in the Middle East. And that's just scratching the surface. I'm not presenting any of this as a justification for the US-Saudi relationship, but sometimes it's useful to take a look at why two countries became friends in the first place, just like on Facebook. So what do you think about the US-Saudi Arabia alliance? Leave your comments below. And remember, we rely on support from viewers like you, so we can keep covering controversial topics. You can pledge your support by contributing $1 or more through the crowdfunding website Patreon. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.